Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Carl O. Snowden.
Let me, before getting started, ask the planning committee to come forward. Jane and Sarah and Dee and Juanita. Juanita, could you come up for a moment? I just want to acknowledge our planning committee. Just want to give them a hand view again, thank them. They helped to organize this and put it together. These are magnificent organizers. So let's give them another round of applause. And now just before getting into the remarks, I want to, there's a person, there are two people in the room that in a moment you'll understand why what I'm about to do is important. History is one of those things that I'm so fond of. People often don't realize the importance of history. And when you get an opportunity to meet history makers, people who made a difference, it changes your life forever. So I'm going to ask Chief Johnson to come forward, as well as Lieutenant Johnson, two history makers here in our city. Would you come forward for a moment? And I want to just briefly tell them who you are. Chief Joseph Johnson is the first African-American police chief in the city of Annapolis. If you go on the Arundel, go to the police department, his name is on the building, well deserved. And on my right here is Lieutenant Clarence Johnson, who became the first African-American commanding officer in the Annapolis Fire Department. It took 300 years for that to occur. The police department in the city of Annapolis was started in 1875. And it took a long time, but these two gentlemen were able to make it. So let's give them another round. Let me thank everyone again for attending. One of the things I really strongly believe is important for us to control the narrative, to tell a story. And everybody has a story to tell. And sometimes these stories are lost in history. I just want to share two things with you, and then we'll open up for some questions. Most people do not realize that I've had a career that has included radio. WNN radio station hired me when I was 16 years old, thanks to a man named Morris Blum. I've also served in television. WJZ TV in Baltimore hired me when I was 24 years old. And I worked as a commentator for WJZ television, as well as a panelist on a program called Square Off. And so I've got an understanding, I think, of how media works and why it's so important to control both the images and the narrative. But I wanted to share with you my own experience. I've been very fortunate. Many of you know I often talk about my mother. My mother lived to be 104 years old. And every time I think of my mother, I think about the things that she saw in her lifetime. Here's a woman that was born in 1916, before women had the right to vote. She was the mother of 11 children. She had this desire, burning desire, to see her children lives better than her own. My mother was a maid. And for those who don't know what a maid is, it's a domestic worker. She had the responsibility of cleaning houses. And one day my mother told me a story that I want to share with you that I've never forgotten. My mother told me one day she was cleaning this woman's house here in Annapolis at a place off of Forest Drive. And my brother, who's now deceased, had gotten ill, and she had to go home to see him, to take care of him. So as the custom of that day was that when you worked, you got paid at the end of the day. And so around 1:30 or 2 o'clock, when my mother was ready to go home, the woman who she worked for took her time coming down the banister, down the stairs. And she took a white glove that she had. And she took the white glove and wiped the banister down to see if there were any dust on this shelf that my mother had just finished cleaning. And when my mother told me this story, I could tell she was very angry. And so I said to my mother, "Why didn't you say anything?" And without missing a beat, she said something that years later would resonate with me. I understood much better. She said, "Because we had to take care of you, and to make sure that you were able to survive." That connected with a story that I want to tell you about. That probably helped shape who I am today. Most people think I grew up in Annapolis. I actually grew up on a farm in a place called Davisonville, Maryland, which is a suburb of Annapolis. And when I was growing up, this was in the 50s, we lived on this farm. I had a friend, little boy, his name was Tommy. And Tommy was an incredible young boy. Tommy had a father, his name was Mr. Marshall. And if you saw Mr. Marshall, you would have been amazed at this man. Mr. Marshall was a sharecropper. I didn't know what a sharecropper was. But I used to see Mr. Marshall, and he was always working. He was an incredibly strong man. I used to see Mr. Marshall take a plow and literally plow the field. I watched Mr. Marshall as he stripped tobacco, cut trees. He was an amazing man. His vocation and avocation was the same thing, hard work. He was just an amazing man. And Tommy loved his father. Tommy loved his father. He held him in such great admiration. In truth, he revered his father. Tommy once told me that his father was so strong that he could beat Superman. And in our days, Superman was the strongest creature that we knew. To appreciate Tommy and appreciate the situation in which we grew up in, you have to envision that our playground was the woods. Tommy and I would go into these woods and play. Sometimes we would take a twig, and that twig would be transformed into a space gun or a six-shooter. We'd get on a fallen tree, and that would become our spaceship. Our playground was only limited by our imagination, and we had the entire woods to play in. And Tommy and I loved playing in those woods. We saw things and experienced things that only little boys at 5 and 6 could experience. It's amazing to be part of nature. One day while Tommy and I were playing, as we normally did, the man that Tommy's father worked for lived in a place we called the Big House. We called it the Big House because it was bigger than Tommy's father's house. It was up on a hill. And Tommy's father worked for this man. This man started walking toward Tommy's father's house. And I don't know what it was, but we knew intuitively, instinctively, something was wrong. This man walked and he was angry, and we couldn't figure out what it was. But in those days, children did not get in adults' business. It's not your responsibility to get in adults' business. But we were curious. We really wanted to know what was going on. So Tommy and I ran ahead of this man and got to Tommy's father's house, and we hid in some bushes. We could see what was going on, but nobody could see us as we hid in these particular bushes. And this man was walking toward Tommy's house angrily. And in those days, people would chew tobacco, literally chew tobacco, and they would spit tobacco out as they were doing it. what they were doing. So when the man reaches Tommy's house, he knocks on the door. Tommy's mother answers the door and he asks, "Where's Marshall?" And she replied, "He's sick. He's sick. He can't come to work today." The man brushed aside Mr. Marshall's wife and went inside. We heard a cacophony of sound, and it wasn't a long time, but it appeared to be long, just a few moments. And shortly thereafter, out comes Tommy's father. He's half dressed. He has no shirt on. He has no shoes on. And behind him is his boss. And his boss is saying to him, "If you don't come to work today, I want you off of my land and out of my house." Then he uses a racial epithet directed at Tommy's father. As Tommy's father turns around to protest being told to get off the land, the man catches Tommy's father off balance and he shoves Tommy's father. And Tommy's father falls to the ground, and this man spat upon Tommy's father with that tobacco. For me, the whole world came to a halt. I had seen Tommy's father. I saw the power of Tommy's father. I knew what Tommy's father was capable of doing. I'd seen him put a calf on his back. I'd seen him cut trees down. I'd seen Tommy's father with these bulging muscles and these biceps. And for a moment, I thought I was about to witness a catastrophe. I thought I was about to see violence occur. But Tommy's father did something I have never forgotten. I will remember it until the day I die. Tommy's father, who was on the ground, who had just been spit upon by this man, says, "I'm so sorry, boss. Please don't fire me. I'm so sorry. I shall come to work. Don't fire me." The man said to Tommy's father, "Well, get on up here and get to work." And he started walking toward the big house. And as Mr. Marshall was getting up from this dust and dirt, as he was rising up, he came to eye level where Tommy and I were hiding. Tommy was crying profusely, and so was I. Tommy took off running. To this day, I can't tell you where he went. I just know he ran. I ran too. I wanted to go home to my mother, tell my mother what I had just witnessed. And my mother, being the woman she was, didn't want me to be embittered or bitter. She wanted me to be better, and so she tried to explain to me what I had witnessed. But I saw something with my own eyes. Years later, people would explain to me, they would say to me, "Well, Carl, you know, remember, this is the 50s. This is before black people had certain rights. And so therefore, you've got to understand that Mr. Marshall took this abuse because he had to." Little boys don't understand the sociology of the times. That day I saw something with my own eyes. It was more than a young boy being embarrassed and a man being humiliated in front of his wife, his child, and his son's best friend. On that day, I witnessed the emasculation of a man. On that day, I saw raw racism. Tommy never did again, ever, tell me that his father was stronger than mine. Tommy never held his father with the kind of respect and love. On that day, something happened to me. I remember saying to myself, I might have been 5 years old, I'm never going to let somebody do that to me. Years later, I would change that to or anyone else. I don't think people really can appreciate what this did to Tommy. Years later, we would have something called the Civil Rights Movement. Years later, there would be a young Baptist minister, 26 years old, who would say to his people, but he'd say it to the world, Sister Rosa, it is better that we walk in dignity than ride in shame. And out of that would come the bus boycott of 1955, and people would have an opportunity to see men and women standing in unity and demanding that this system be changed. I grew up in an era and a time when I knew what a segregated school was. I went to a segregated school. I remember being in Davisonville and riding by the all-white Davisonville Elementary School so I would be able to go to a place called Gambles, Maryland, where Carver Elementary School was. I remember being in a situation where there was an all-black class. I remember the administrators, the janitors, the teachers all being people of color. I remember my elders telling me, even at that young age, 3rd grade, boy, get a good education. It's the one thing they cannot take away from you. I remember them saying to me over and over again, you got to be twice as smart to get half as far. So by the time integration came, and I came to Annapolis, I went to an integrated school called Annapolis Elementary School. And I will forever appreciate something that happened to me at Annapolis Elementary School. It is probably one of the great things that occurred in my life. I had an English teacher, a reading teacher. Her name was Mrs. Anderson. I never will forget Mrs. Anderson because she taught me something very, very valuable. Mrs. Anderson told me the difference between reading and comprehension. She explained to me clearly what the difference was. And then Mrs. Anderson did something that I would later learn she did on her own. It was not part of the curriculum, it was something that she did. Mrs. Anderson wanted to teach us the value of reading. And so what she would do is take a silver dollar, and in that day, a silver dollar could buy you a lot of stuff. And for me, it was comic books and snacks and the like. And Mrs. Anderson said, for the student that read a book, she would give us the book to read, and then for you to give a report, an oral report. And if you did it successfully, she'd give you a silver dollar. And I collected so many silver dollars. And started reading. I would later learn the value of not only being able to read, but to comprehend. Mrs. Anderson, to this day, I admire her for putting into me this desire to read, to begin to understand. That would later become very important for me. I would go to, as was mentioned by the introduction, to a school called Annapolis High School. When I went to Annapolis High School, my experiences were reversed to what they were when I was in elementary school. When I was in elementary school, all administrators were black. People in authority or positions of authority were all African Americans. When I got to Annapolis High School, it was the exact reverse. There was not a single African American in a leadership position at all. We had even the mascot, which was a Black Panther mascot. The mascot was white. Black people, it's a different situation. One day I was told by, again, another English teacher. The English teacher told me that I had to read a book And the book I had to read was called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. And they said, you don't even have to read the entire book. We want you to read 2 chapters of The Autobiography of Malcolm X, chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 is entitled Nightmare. Just read this book. And my decision at that time, I kind of lost interest in school. It wasn't my big thing. I was pulling probably a C average, if that. So my English teacher said, read this autobiography of Malcolm X. This is in 1969. Malcolm X had been assassinated in 1965, so I picked up the autobiography of Malcolm X. I had never heard of Malcolm X. Didn't know who he was. And my idea was just to read 1 or 2 pages, and the next day when I got to school, just wing it. I picked up the autobiography of Malcolm X and literally could not put it there. It's the first book I read from cover to cover, and it literally changed my whole perspective on life. Malcolm X asked questions in his autobiography that I had never even thought of, never dreamt of. What color was Jesus, he said. Do you know, he said, what part of the world Jesus came from? And then he had this debate with this gentleman while he was in prison. And while the man would not concede that Jesus was black, he did say to Malcolm, he might have been brown. And from Malcolm's perspective, that conceded to him that people need to do more studies. And I mean, I was just a changed person. Literally changed. The book had a tremendous impact on my life. So one day we were at an assembly at Annapolis High School, and the way the assemblies worked at Annapolis High School was about 1,500 students, and all the students could not occupy the assembly hall at the same time, so it would take us in turn. But 500 students would go to Maryland Hall, where this assembly was taking place. So we go to Maryland Hall for a regular assembly. There's nothing particularly special about that particular day. And we're in, and Student Government Association president, who's white. Everybody up on the stage was white. They had a country band that was playing, which was all white. And some student in the audience, with the lights down low, shouted, "We want some soul music." And the student government president took the microphone and said to the audience, "This is our assembly. This is our program. And if you don't like it, you can leave." And a hush just fell over the audience. And I may have been sitting there for about 20 seconds when it dawned on me, he's right. If I don't like it, what I'm sitting here for? So I got up, and in those days at Maryland Hall, when you got up, the seats flapped up. So I got up to leave, and as I was walking out, something said, flap, 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 flap. And 150 black students followed me out. Wow. And then we decided we were going to protest. This is what got me expelled from Annapolis High School. We decided we wasn't going to miss school. We'd go to school every single day, and we did. We'd go to class, but we wouldn't go in the classroom. We'd go down to the library, go down to the cafeteria, and have what we call freedom schools. And we'd have somebody get up who was an African American, who had just read something in long black studies or black history that we as a group didn't know and would teach. And this went on for 2 weeks. Students showing up at Annapolis High School. The newspaper started covering it, and the newspaper had the story about Negroes walk out of Annapolis High School. The principal was a man named Mr. Albert Fowler, who was the principal at the time. And so we started boycotting these classes. So after about 2 weeks, it was decided this had to come to a halt. So they sent in 3 people to speak to us, students who were protesting. One you would know very well. He was the late mayor of Annapolis. His name was Roger Moyer. We called him Pit Moyer. The second was a guy named Zashel Sims, which some of you would know. Third was a man named Samuel Gilmer, who was then the president of the NAACP. And the fourth man was a man named Walter Blasingame. And so they came there, and each of them spoke to the group that was there, encouraging us to go back to class. And Pip Moyer referred to us as brothers and sisters, and I understand why you feel the way you feel it, but we can work on this and go back to class. And nobody responded. Then Zashua got up and he said a few words, and again, nobody responded. And then, of course, Sam Gilmer got up and said, the NAACP is with you, but you guys got to go back to class. Again, nobody responded. The fourth person was a man named Walter Blasingame. Mr. Blasingame was a very tall gentleman who had a soft-spoken voice. And he, too, started telling us to go back to class. But he saw the group wasn't responding. And then he said, if you go back to class, we're going to have this problem of no black studies in your curriculum and no black participation in assemblies and no black cheerleaders. We're going to have that solved in 30 days. And the students said, boo, 30 days is too long. So he then responded, well, we'll do it in 3 weeks. People said, oh. So finally he said, we'll do it in 10 days, 2 weeks. And again, people said, oh. But I was sitting there and said, 2 weeks? Didn't seem like a bad idea. 2 weeks to have a black studies program, 2 weeks to have the change in the system. So I responded to it by saying, I think it's a good idea. I think we should go back to class. If we're going to have all this done in 2 weeks, we should go back to class. Now, I need to let some of you know, who are my age group, when I was growing up, there used to be this slogan, or this motto, never trust anyone 30. I understand why. Because they lied to us. They got us back to class. We went back to class as we were promised. And in 2 weeks, not a single thing had changed, except one thing. We didn't have police officers that would be at the school. And the students got very angry because these people had not kept their commitment. So there was a meeting in Eastport with a group of students who were organizing it, and we decided that on February 12th, 1970, February 12th was selected because it's the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, we're going to do emancipation. We're going to restart these boycotts and these demonstrations. And this time we're not going to go back to class until they actually do this work. So the group voted to do this, and we had one student who was a female who worked in an office at Annapolis High School. And in those days, they used to have what they called a mimeograph paper. Remember mimeograph? We had to run off the flyers. So her job was to go in and secretively run off these leaflets so we could tell the students about this boycott that was going to come the very next day, which is what we were going to call it. So as she was preparing to run off this mimeograph, an administrator came in and caught her and took this one sheet that represented this demonstration that was going to take place, and gave it to the principal, Mr. Fallon. And the principal immediately took the flyer, the leaflet, and we had an old public address system. When you talk to people, you talk to the whole school over the public address system. And he got on the public address system and said, it's my understanding there's going to be a demonstration tomorrow, beginning at 8:00 a.m. Anybody who participates in this demonstration will be suspended or subject to expulsion. Well, what he didn't know was not a single student knew about the demonstration. So he informed all of the students about the demonstrations. And those of you who have experience with young people know the last thing you want to tell young people is what they cannot do. The next day, hundreds of people participated in this demonstration, and that led to what was called a melee. And as you heard, 14 of us were later expelled from Annapolis High School. And the superintendent of schools was a man named Edward Anderson. Dr. Anderson told my mother, who was there to try to get me back into school, he said, as long as I'm the superintendent of Anne Arundel County Public Schools, your son will never go to a public school in this county. And he turned out to be right. But thanks to some benefactors, they raised some money and I went to Key School. Harry's with me, one of my graduating colleagues who was in my school, high school at the time. I went to Annapolis at the Key School. It was an incredible experience because when I went to Key School at that time, you were required to take a foreign language. You were required to be prepared to go to college. And so one of the things there was what they call French immersion. French immersion. It's a concept that if you get around people and everybody's speaking French, you learn the language quicker. But you have to immerse yourself in that culture. So I didn't do well in French. I was having problems. Comme vous très bien merci, oui? And my French teacher was a woman named Ann T. And she said, this is not going to work. So I wasn't the only one. There was another woman named Barbara, a young girl named Barbara in my same class. She too was having a problem with French. So it was decided that in order for me to graduate, or for us to graduate, we had to take summer school together. And we had to do it over at St. John's College, where I got a French tutor to help me master this French so I could graduate. Well, Barbara was supposed to do it with me. But Barbara's father came up with an idea. Barbara's father said, well, rather than have Barbara go to St. John's College over the summer, we're going to send Barbara to Paris, France for 6 weeks. And they did. And she got an A. Because it's true, opportunities does make a difference. Sorry, Mr. Fogel, would you please, opportunity does make a difference. So one of the things that my mother taught me was, sorry about that, thank you, see if we can turn this off. One of the things my mother taught me was to make sure that people understand certain things. Because we all assume that everybody comes from the same culture, and we don't. So one of the things they required us to do in French, in my French class, was when you go home, you were told and instructed to talk to your parents over the dinner table and ask them to pass the butter in French. This is part of the immersion campaign. So I went home and told my mother, she said, we got no butter here, we got margarine. And so she was able to help me understand that, you know, folks just didn't get it. And so, as you probably guess, I was able to graduate from Key School. I was part of the first graduating class of Key School in 1971. There were only 4 of us. Was that right, Harry? That were black, that graduated that year in 1971. But a very small graduating class. 3. It was 3. One of the guys that came to Key School with us, his name was Anthony Price, who later committed suicide. It's amazing what people have to go through and what people went through during this particular era. So I want to wind up my remarks by saying this to you. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book, it's a collection of essays, because it's important who tells the story. And there are things about our history, both nationally and locally that will get lost. Here's a national issue. If you ask the average person who's watching tonight's program who Madison, Washington was, they can't tell you. No, I'm not talking about James Madison, and I'm talking about George Washington, but who was Madison, Washington? And when I tell people that Madison, Washington was a black man that freed more black people than Abraham Lincoln did, and he did it 20 years beforehand, they're stunned. And when they Google it, they discovered there was a black man named Madison, Washington, that people who matriculate to colleges and universities and people with doctoral degrees have never heard of. If you tell people what I'm about to tell you, that the ninth vice president of the United States was a man named Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the vice president of a man named Martin Van Buren. If you tell them what I'm about to tell you, they will find it stunning, because they've been to school, nobody ever told them this. Nobody ever told them that the ninth vice president of the United States, Richard Mentor Johnson, had a black wife, and that wife had 2 black daughters. And many people think the first blended family that occurred in America is with the current vice president, who happens to be married to a man who has white stepchildren. The truth of the matter is, the first blended family occurred under Richard Mentor Johnson. And that was when Martin Van Buren was president of the United States. It might also explain why he didn't win a second term, but he was, in fact, the first vice president to marry a black woman. And most people have no knowledge of that at all. Being able to control the narrative is important. I'm going to be doing a series of lectures of local history this coming Monday over at Mount Moriah Church. And one of the questions I'm going to ask people is this. In Annapolis, where most people live, who've lived here, do people really know why Annapolis is called Annapolis? Do people know who Queen Anne was, who Annapolis is named after? Do people know who the Duke of York was? Duke of York, by the way, is who New York State is named after. He was the father of Queen Anne, and what they made their money off was human trafficking. They sold slaves, they sold people. And so the city of Annapolis and Queen Anne's County is named in honor of Queen Anne. And if you ask people who live in Annapolis for long periods of time, just certain questions, you'd be amazed how people don't know local history. They just don't know. The reason why, when she read my biography, it said I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, which is true, at Johns Hopkins. But what they didn't tell you is why I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. And the reason was that in Annapolis, if you were a black woman, there was a time you could not birth your children at the local hospital. You had to go to Baltimore to have children. And so a lot of people who are black at a certain age who have Baltimore as their birthplace, it has to do with systemic racism. My father, whose name was John Brown, never liked Anne Arundel Medical Center because of an experience she had. My grandfather, who we lived with on the farm in Davidsonville, had a stroke. And he was rushed from the hospital, Davidsonville, to Anne Arundel. It was then called Annapolis Emergency Hospital, I believe. And it wouldn't serve my grandfather or my mother's father. So he was forced to go to what's called Freeman Hospital, which is in Washington, D.C. And anybody who knows anything about strokes know that the earliest you address that problem, the more likelihood someone will survive. And he died after having a stroke. And my mother never forgot that. So I think it's important that as we record history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that people who have these experiences tell their story. It is a way of therapeutic. It's a way of getting it out of the system. Having people hear from you, the individual. In Annapolis, in 1973, in this city, to give you an idea of what it was like. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday became a state holiday in 1974. But prior to that, a group of people, black and white, went down to the Annapolis City Council and said, we ought to have a street named in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Because there was no street at that time in honor of Dr. King. And the City Council agreed. And the street was changed. And the majority of the people who lived on that street was African American. They signed a petition to change the street name back to its original name. A little piece of history I think people should know. The street, by the way, was called Clay Street. And people thought that Clay Street was named after Henry Clay, and it wasn't. It got its name because it was part of a brickyard, and people called it Clay Street. But the people who lived on that street at that time actually did not want the street named after Dr. King. And there's this famous photo of Reverend Leroy Bowman putting up the sign, and then Alderman John Chambers and a guy named, not Norwood Brown, but Roscoe Parker. He was the alderman of the Old Fourth Ward. Everybody's smiling with this change going up. And in less than 2 weeks, it came down. Just for that part of history. And it's just important for people to know. So as I move to this final conclusion, thank you, Dee, for letting me know the time is fast approaching. I want to share this final story with you. And it's a true story. When I served on the Annapolis City Council, of all the issues I've ever dealt with on the Annapolis City Council, the one issue that actually got death threats, and I saw a side of Annapolis I didn't believe existed. I put a bill in. It was a very simple bill. It was a bill that required all private clubs to not discriminate based on race, gender, nationality, or religion. And what we discovered in Annapolis was that there were clubs that discriminated based on people's race, their color, their gender, etc. So I put this particular bill in to get this law changed so that these clubs couldn't discriminate. And a woman from Eastport had tried to join the Eastport Democratic Club, which at one time was all white. And when she put her application in, they used to have these black balls. If you get one black ball, you can't become a member. She had to do this distinction of getting 23 black balls. And so she called me up, and she said, Mr. Snowden, I just don't understand. I could see if I was colored, but I'm a white woman. And they did this to me. Well, as fate would have it, in Annapolis, when this law did pass and it was challenged, the reason why the Elks Club no longer exists in the city of Annapolis, it used to be where the district court is because the Elks Club had a policy that was written in their bylaws. And the policy says that if you were a woman, you could not be a member of the Elks. You couldn't be a member. And so it got challenged. It went up to the Court of Appeals, which is Maryland's highest court. The court upheld the law, saying that if you get a liquor license in Annapolis, you can't discriminate based on your race or gender or religion. So Elks was so angry of that ruling that they sold the building that you now know as the district court to the state of Maryland, and they now exist outside of the city limits. That's a part of history that is often not told. And so what this book attempts to do is to share with you views of various history that has occurred. And I got to tell you one thing I'm really proud of in this book. Please look at this date. It's June 19th, 2019. And it's in the book, I made a prediction that the President of the United States, a guy named Donald Trump, will not get reelected president. I said in this column that the American people, after seeing what they had been going through, would decide not to elect him as President of the United States. And I also pointed out that there were people like the CIA director, the NSA director, and others, including Louis Gracie, who's here tonight, all calling for the president to resign. And the voters made a decision, and they voted him out of office. So that was done a year before the election. So thank you, sir, very much for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity. We should take a few questions, if anyone has any questions. Yes. Tony.
My name is Tony Spencer. I'm a paramedic back in...
My name is Tony Spencer. I was a paramedic back in March, Carl, of 1992, when the last trial that would not be accepted at Arundel was black, which I take to Baltimore. And so, on the way from Forest Drive, Newtown, 19, the child was delivered in the back seat of the car. He was still Alderman. And because of that, got the law changed, and thanks to no longer had to go to Baltimore or Washington.
Wow.
I just want to make that.
Any other questions? Chuck, was that you?
No.
Oh, Monica.
Do you think your trajectory would have changed if you hadn't been expelled from Annapolis High School?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, turns out that Dr. Anderson did me a great favor by me going to Key School. That really opened doors for me and got me to see things that I doubt very seriously I would have seen. One of the things that, by going to Key School, I actually saw that there was a different world. And there, even today, if you get a chance, ask any local Annapolitan, somebody who's been there all their lives, you will discover that in Annapolis, even after all these many years, there are people who are Annapolitans, been Annapolitans all their lives, but there are parts of the city they've never visited. They've never been there. Absolutely not been there. The only thing they know about these particular communities is what they read in the newspaper. And sometimes it's not true or accurate, but that's all they know. And believe it or not, there are people who are native Annapolitans who have never gone to the Naval Academy, have never been to St. John's College, have never been in the State House. They exist. And one of the things that the current mayor's talked about is the One Annapolis. And that goal is really to get Annapolitans to really begin to understand that there should be and there is one Annapolis. We've got to get to know each other better, be able to see how fortunate we are as a nation. Annapolis, by the way, population used to be 35% African Americans lived in the city of Annapolis. It's now down to 21% and dropping. And you can trace it to certain policies that are promulgated that exist. Yes, ma'am.
Hold on. Here.
For the young,
Hold on. Never mind.
for the young man that's looking at you now, what is the one thing or piece of advice that you would give him that would be able to set his footsteps similar to what you are doing now, but not be so difficult? And I commend you on what you are doing now.
Thank you. That gives me an opportunity to share something I tell people all the time. I love telling this story because it's so true. If you tell a person who's going from Maryland to California, and you say to that person, who gets to California first? Somebody flying nonstop, somebody on a train, they've got an Amtrak is at BWI Airport, or somebody's walking. And 99% of the people will tell you that the person who will get to California first under the conditions I just described is the person that's going by the plane. And when you ask them why, they say, well, because the plane is the fastest mode of transportation. And therefore, that person's going to get there first. And then when I tell them what the real answer is, they say, oh, I hadn't thought of that. The real answer is the first person that will get to California first is who God intends to get there. Planes sometimes don't take off, trains derail, but what I've learned is what God has in store for each of us. No man or woman can change. So what I try to get people to understand is all of us are here for a purpose, and we got to find out what that purpose is. Maya Angelou, who I got to interview, I interviewed Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, two great interviews that I'm so glad I had that opportunity to do. And what I found out in interviewing Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, they were able to see beyond the moment. And that's what I would tell young people. What I'm about to say to you now, you'll be able to rationalize. But it's going to be hard for some people to see this. In about 20 years or less, there's a technology that exists. It already exists today. It's just not universally used. If you ever watch the United Nations and you see a president of a country addressing members of the United Nations, what you will note is that the person who's addressing the United Nations is speaking in his or her native tongue. And these people have these earphones on, and the language is being translated as the speaker speaks. Well, in about 20 years, people are going to be able to pick up a cell phone, call anywhere in the world. People who never could speak, people who don't speak Chinese will be able to call China, and in their native tongue have that converted to Chinese. And the Chinese recipient on the other end will be able to speak back to you in their native tongue, having it translated into English, and it's going to change the whole way we do the world. The language has been a barrier, will no longer be a barrier. And I've got a granddaughter who's 6 years old, my youngest granddaughter. And it's hard for her to envision that one day she was talking about taking a trip to a place called Jupiter or Mars or Venus, things that we don't even comprehend. In fact, I told one of my granddaughters one day, be like Superman, you know, go to a telephone booth, change clothes, we gotta go. And my granddaughter said, Granddaddy, what's a telephone? When you think about it, I mean, this technology is moving very, very rapidly. So I think we've got some good stuff going. And one of the things I'm so proud of is young people. Young people making the difference. The things that we used to see and experience. I'm just so invested in young people because I really do think they're part of this vanguard that's changing. The world is changing in ways that are unbelievable. To see people in Shadyside and Deal and Pasadena talking about Black Lives Matter, it's a big deal. Its attitudes are really changing very rapidly in this country. And we're about to make a decision as a nation what kind of country we're going to have. Because, of course, there's also a reactionary force that's in this society. But I've got a feeling that the vast majority of people, particularly young people, understand that this world is a world that we all have to figure out how to live together in. For those of you who have maybe never given any thought to global warming, you can see how it's changing, how the climate is changing right before our eyes. And young people in particular understand how important it is to deal with the environment. So I'm very, very hopeful that the future will be brighter and that there will be people who will be willing to take a stand. This is probably a good note to end on because I think it describes Annapolis and places like Annapolis. There is a group of people, most people do not know where they're going to, how they're going to die, where they're gonna die, or the day they're gonna die. That's true for a vast majority of people. But there's one group of people who do know. People on death row. If you're on death row, you get the date, you get the time, and you get the method of how you're gonna die. And I read a very interesting piece that really struck me. We had a man do some research, and he went in and he talked to people who knew the day they were gonna die, how they're gonna die, and where they're gonna die. And he asked them all the same question. Now that you know death is certain, what is it you would do different? What is the last things you want to do before death? And believe it or not, overwhelmingly, these are people on death row. These are people who committed murders or some heinous crime. But overwhelmingly, people said they were given a second opportunity. Here are the things they would do, and it's all good stuff they would do. And I got a feeling that when most people find where death is imminent, they begin to think of all the things they could do to make the world better. I'm just hoping that we change the paradigm. That we begin to think about how can we make the world better, not because death is imminent, because life is so important, and how we can make the world better. I often tell people that when I became a grandfather, I thought that I'd spend most of my life as a grandfather looking back, thinking about the good old days. I realize now as a grandfather, I spend most of my time looking to the future. What is this world going to look like? What kind of opportunities are they going to have? What can I do to make the world better that they're going to inherit? And I give a lot of thought to the future and where we're going, both as a community and as a nation. And in this particular book, some people watch clocks to know what time it is. I watch people. And I've learned that if you pay attention to people, just be more observant, you'll be surprised what you can learn. 90% of the people who walk out of this building, who go into their cars, never look up. People just look straight forward. You got to really begin to pay attention to your environment and begin to see things that's happening. And you'll be surprised just by paying attention how much you can learn, how much you can accomplish. So on that note, unless there are other questions, we'll go back to the book signing. Is that right, Gloria?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, could you all join me in thanking the staff and I've got a commitment from Apostle Palmer that the next book I write, he said his company will produce. He told me he'll do that. I'm going to take him up on that.
Mr. Snowden, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Anne Arundel County Public Library for this inspirational, historic, and moving conversation this evening and presentation. It is an honor that this is our first author talk here at the Michael E. Bush Library, and we are ecstatic to have you as our notable and renowned civil rights activist and author here for our first author program at the library. So we are honored, sir.
Thank you so very much.
And
I'd like to end with one thing, if I might.
oh, please.
Something we do often, people in the community know this, but I really think it's important. I always tell people this, and most of you have heard this before, but there's some people who haven't. So get ready for a little bit, something a little different. I tell people that I thought Dr. King was one of our greatest leaders that ever lived. But Dr. King left us with really two basic messages. The first one we got. Dr. King told us that when we come together, people of goodwill, he said when we come together, we change America and we change the world. And he gives many examples of that happening when people of goodwill come together. When people of goodwill came together in the 60s, we changed the course of history. The reason there's a 1965 Voting Rights Act was because the people of goodwill came together. The reason Angela Davis did not die in the gas chamber was because the people of goodwill got together and said, this woman should not die. And people organized and energized and mobilized the community. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday became a national holiday when other people didn't think it would be, because people organized. Nelson Mandela walked out of a prison into the presidency because people of goodwill organized. We have seen it over and over again. When people of goodwill join hands, they change America. But Dr. King also said something else to us. And this is the part we have the most difficulty with. And it's a thing that we have to continue to try to work on. Dr. King said that ultimately the problems of this world will be solved by people learning how to respect and love one another. That sounds like a simple proposition, but we see all over the world and in America polarization. So Dr. King tried to teach us the necessity of learning to love one another. And so I end most of the community meetings we had when we did a caucus by just asking somebody to turn to your neighbor, look him or her directly in the eye. Okay, you gotta look at your neighbor. Look at your neighbor. Look at your neighbor directly in the eye. I want to show you something. Now, while you look at the neighbor in the eye, I want you to utter these 3 words. I love you. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. When I was 14 years old, I tell people this all the time. Margaret, a girl looked me in the eye and said, I love you. And the next day she was with somebody else. So I figured it out. I know when people really love you. When somebody says, I love you, if you don't get that tingle, you don't get that feeling, it ain't real. But the window, the eyes is the window to the soul. If you look at somebody, look in people's eyes, that's the window to their soul. If you pay attention, you can see it. So look at your neighbor this time, really good. Keep an eye. You just simply say, I love you.
And I try hard to get my daughter. It's hard to get in there if you don't know. Like all the good times.
My daughter went right there. My daughter's 53. But she went